Hello, everyone watching on the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign YouTube channel. I'm joined today by someone that many of you will have seen speak at previous events, Calvin Tucker, who is a member of our executive committee and also a journalist for Morning Star, amongst many other things. Calvin has been in Venezuela last month, April, where they marked 20 years since they defeated the US coup against Hugo Chavez. And he's just going to speak to us for a few minutes today about his experiences. So welcome, Calvin. And first of all, can you tell us a little bit more about why you were in Venezuela and also how it was there compared with some of your other more recent trips?
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And thank you to the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign for inviting me as a guest here today. I was in Venezuela on the 11th, 12th and 13th of April. Now, I remember those 3 days very well because that's the 20th anniversary of the coup against Hugo Chavez. And those 3 days in April 2002 really shook the world. Chavez, the legitimate elected president of the country, was kidnapped at gunpoint by soldiers loyal to the coup dictator Pedro Carmona, and then within an incredibly short space of time, there was a complete turnaround as masses and masses of people streamed out of the barrios that surround Caracas and demanded the return of their president. The army, lower ranking officers and the ordinary soldiers rebelled, and Chavez was returned in a helicopter 3 days later, and triumphant defeat for US imperialism. So this conference was billed as a conference against fascism. It was held deliberately on the anniversary of that coup, but it dealt with issues globally and locally in Latin America that went further than those specific events.
And how was your perspective, perhaps outside the conference for a minute, when you know, arriving at the airport, when you outside in your accommodation or other places? How was your perception of how Venezuela is currently compared with last time you went there, which I think was quite recent?
Well, I was actually there the previous November, but the big contrast was from 2018 when I observed the presidential election where the President Nicolas Maduro was re-elected to another term in office. And at that time, which is only 4 years previously, the signs of economic decay and the effects of sanctions were absolutely in your face and apparent wherever you went, from something as small as the lights in your hotel room not working properly, or the hot water not coming out when you turn the tap on. That kind of fairly trivial experience from a tourist perspective, if you like, right down to the more serious economic issues as they confronted ordinary Venezuelans. A lack of foodstuff. I mean, people were not starving. That was Western propaganda, but certainly just to eat and to eat any kind of a healthy, nutritious diet was an absolute struggle for millions and millions of Venezuelans. And of course, the sanctions were actually begun under Obama, not under Trump. People don't necessarily understand that. Those sanctions had a dramatic effect on every aspect of the Venezuela's economy, from the oil industry right down to being able to import a machine tool part of an essential piece of equipment had broken. The contrast with my visit this time was really quite dramatic. Gone were the boarded up shops. There were signs of renewed economic activity everywhere I looked. There were large numbers of very ordinary Venezuelans sitting in cafes around Caracas, eating. I didn't see the levels of marginalized people in the streets. People were not coming up to me begging for food or money. The security situation was very peaceful, very tranquil. We were able to go out at night until the early hours of the morning in Caracas, walk around unmolested, not too concerned about the normal fear that people have on the streets, and not just in Venezuela, but right across Latin America. So really quite a significant turnaround economically, and that's partly due to the rise in the price of oil, but also because Venezuelan's oil company PDVSA has been able to successfully increase oil production in the face of sanctions, and also in other areas of the economy to find a way around making financial transactions. So whilst things are not good in Venezuela, the signs of economic recovery and that filtering all the way down to the ordinary man and woman and child in the street are significant and noticeable.
And would you say, in terms of your conversation with Venezuelans you met at the conference and people you know more generally there, I suppose, that improving economic situation also leads to a more stable and peaceful political situation for the elected government?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the level of political tension in the street has completely dissipated, at least in Caracas. I mean, I didn't go outside Caracas, so I can't comment on that. But obviously, this is the capital city, and it's historically been the focus of huge pro-government demonstrations and protests, and on the other hand, huge protests and demonstrations in support of the US-backed opposition. I mean, what's been occurring over the last couple of years is that the opposition has taken a different tack on Venezuela. So the majority of the opposition has now agreed to participate in the democratic electoral process, against the wishes of the United States, incidentally, and against the wishes of Juan Guaido, the self-declared president of Venezuela, who now cuts a very lonely, isolated figure. So the main change that's happened is it's now absolutely clear, including to every cool-headed member of the opposition, that Nicolas Maduro remains the president of Venezuela. He's not going anywhere unless he's defeated at the ballot box. And so those sections of the opposition that are more realistic have made, to some extent, peace with the Bolivarian process and seek to use their influence and their political power within a democratic framework. So from that point of view, I think this has been an important political advance for all Venezuelans, wherever they stand on the central issues that face them.
Thanks, Calvin. That's positive news, and most of all, as you say, positive news for ordinary Venezuelan people in terms of the economy and political and democratic stability. If we could sort of go back a step to the event you went to, but more generally to the anniversary of the coup against Chavez, which is something that was also marked in other places across Latin America, Caribbean, and indeed the world. Could you just give us a flavour about like how Chavez is still sort of seen or referred to in the popular movements in Venezuela, and the importance that is given to that particular anniversary? Because obviously from afar, it's perhaps not something that we can fully grasp.
No, I mean, I think the important thing to understand about Hugo Chavez, for most Venezuelans that are alive today, this was the first time they'd ever had a political leader who looked like them, who talked like them, and that they could relate to. That's absolutely key. Traditionally, Venezuelans leaders have been drawn from the mainly white upper classes, and their primary political relationships were with big business and the United States. Hugo Chavez had been very clear that his priority was the ordinary person in what's called the barrios. That's the popular neighborhoods where ordinary people live. But it wasn't simply that Chavez looked like them and sounded like them. He was able to deliver on the promises of the Bolivarian revolution in key areas of housing, of health, and of political and social rights. So he's revered in Venezuela. I mean, I suppose he's sort of somewhere between, you know, a sort of Che Guevara and a kind of godlike figure. And of course, I mean, as somebody looking at that from abroad, we might be thinking this is simply some form of kind of nonsensical hero worship. But when you study the history of Venezuela and the way in which the majority of the population, that's working class and darker skinned Venezuelans, had been simply cut out and removed from political power and treated in a despicable way, both as a class of people and also on an individual basis by employers, by people who lived in big houses and employed them as servants and maids and so on, that this is a very emotional issue for them. So Hugo Chavez, I would say, above all, represents for them hope for a better life, for a better future.
That's a really interesting answer. And just quickly linked to that, I suppose, obviously you talked about a more politically positive situation with most of the opposition being on a different tack to a few years ago when they were sort of agitating for a coup. But I suppose 20 years on from the coup, in Venezuela's sort of progressive movements and amongst the international guests, including yourself at the conference you mentioned, there's still great concern about the US role in Latin America and potentially with regards to trying to go for regime change in Venezuela today. Well,
I think that's a very good point you make, Matt. Of course, it wasn't one single coup in 2002 and everybody lived happily ever after. In fact, there's been a series of mini coups. Some of those have been violent, and some of those have been precipitated by economic destabilization. And of course, it's only 2 or 3 years ago that Juan Guaido, the self-declared president of Venezuela, stood up in a city square in Caracas and declared himself to be the president of the country. A completely fake, ridiculous figure who controls nothing in Venezuela. I mean, controls not a single hospital, a single school, a single civil servant, a single soldier. Yet he remains to this day recognized by most countries in the EU and the United States as the legitimate president of Venezuela. So this has really been a series of coups, some big and some smaller, all with the same objective: to take away the rights of Venezuelans to decide their own political system and their own political future, and have those decisions taken by big business in Caracas in alliance with their political masters in Washington.
Thanks, Calvin, and thank you for an interesting interview. Is there any final comment you'd like to add, both in terms of your visit to Venezuela, but also on the kind of issues that we here in the UK and I suppose elsewhere internationally should be standing for and raising in solidarity with Venezuela and its right to self-determination?
Yeah, absolutely, I would. I mean, the first point I'd make is that Venezuela is not alone. It has the support of millions and millions of ordinary people, not only in Latin America, but across Asia, in Africa. That was very apparent from the very diverse group of delegates that attended the conference in Caracas, and also people from Britain and from countries in Europe. At a governmental level, we've of course seen some very profound changes, regime changes to the left, if you like, in Latin America, in Chile, in Honduras, in Argentina. So the process of isolating Venezuela across the Americas has now been put into reverse, And if you like, I think it would be accurate to say that the left has struck back decisively on the continent. There are, of course, implications for solidarity activists like ourselves. There's no point in us just looking on at this sort of situation from afar as if it was some kind of abstract, exotic adventure that where we're merely spectators, because our governments have been directly involved in trying to overthrow Venezuela's democracy, including the British government, which currently holds through its control of the Bank of England, $1 billion of Venezuelan gold held in the vaults of the Bank of England that they're simply refusing to return to Venezuela, who desperately needs this money for hospitals, for schools, for the economic security of the population. So I would say the biggest message I think that people can take away from this interview is to build and rebuild and strengthen all our solidarity efforts for Venezuela. And I would just like to add that our campaign, the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign, isn't a campaign for Venezuelan socialism. It's a campaign to support and protect the right of Venezuela to decide and choose its own political system. It doesn't actually matter whether you're a socialist or a social democrat or even a supporter of capitalism. Every decent person should be able to get behind the demand that people in other parts of the world should not be victims of US and British imperialism and should be able to decide for themselves in the same way that we here in Britain, in Europe and in North America get to decide our governments and our system.
Thank you very much, Calvin. Anyone watching on the YouTube, some links will appear afterwards to join the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, as Calvin mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.